Hey, what's going on, guys? UFC 300 is a little over 4 months away, and a lot of people are asking, what will be the UFC 300 main event? What will be on the UFC 300 main card? I am here to answer that question. I have built you 2 realistic UFC 300 fight cards and 1 unrealistic UFC 300 fight card. We'll get to that in a second. But currently, there has been 3 fights announced for UFC 300. Jiri Prochazka versus Alexander Rakic, Aljamain Sterling versus Calvin Kattar, and Bo Nickel versus Cody Bumditch. Just for the sake of this video, I'm going to pretend like all those are prelims, and I'm going to build you a main card from scratch. There's a very good possibility that Jiri Prochazka versus Alexander Rakic is on the main card, but for the sake of the video, I'm going to pretend like that's going to headline the prelims. Now, the first card I'm going to start with is a fantasy fight card. And what this card is if this was the last fight card I was ever going to see, and I was able to make the fights, regardless of if they made sense for the divisions or not, these are the fights that I would make if I was in charge of making the fights, and this was the last fight card I was ever going to see, but it's very unrealistic, and almost none of these fights are going to happen. I'm going to go through this card the quickest, but I wanted to include it because there's so many banger matchups that I would love to see that will probably never happen, even in the history of the UFC. The next fight card I'm going to get to is going to be an actual realistic option for UFC 300, and it's going to be a title fight card. And what I mean by that is the main event will be a title fight. And then the last option I'm going to get to is going to be a realistic option for UFC 300, and it is going to be a non-title fight card, meaning the main event will be a non-title fight. Let's start right away with the UFC 300 fantasy card. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly because if I go through all 3 of these fight cards in detail, the video is going to be 45 minutes, but do me a favor. If you guys enjoy these videos, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I'm trying to get to 15,000 subscribers before the end of the year, so I would greatly appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. But starting off with the first fight on the fantasy fight card, opening up the main card, we have Colby Covington versus Belal Muhammad. I know this doesn't really make sense like the rest of the fights on this card. I would love this matchup. Colby Covington coming off a loss against Leon Edwards. He's 2-3 in his last 5. He's calling out the dead carcass of Wonderboy. And the fanboys of Colby Covington are the same people that like to call Belal Muhammad boring and cringe, which I've always found hilarious. And I think Belal Muhammad would starch Colby Covington. I think he'd beat him worse than Leon Edwards did. So I really want to see this matchup. And also it would just be a fun fight, a fun clash of styles. And I would just love to see some of the Colby Covington fans that are left, I would love to see their heads explode when Belal Muhammad were to beat Colby Covington. Moving on to the next fight on the fantasy card. That is Charles Oliveira versus Benoit Saint-Denis. This fight doesn't make sense, but I want this fight badly. Literally, I hate saying corny stuff like this. Inject this fight into my veins. Charles Oliveira versus Benoit Saint-Denis. Maybe the most savage fight that I can think of. I would absolutely love this matchup. I would kill for this matchup. You know, in terms of excitement, is there a more exciting fight that you could book? I don't know if there is. Oliveira versus Saint-Denis would be an absolute banger. Then we're going to move on to the co-main event, or the featured fight on the card. I'm sorry, not the co-main event. The featured fight on the card, I have Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Khamzat Chimaev. Imagine that fight. This is a fight. If you've been a hardcore and kind of following contenders over the last 3 to 4 years, this has kind of been a fantasy fight because they both were in the welterweight division for a while. Now Khamzat Chimaev's moved up. Shavkat Rakhmonov has become a legitimate contender in the welterweight division. This is like one of my dream fights. Honestly, you could make this the main event of UFC 300 and I would die a happy man. I mean, this would be an incredible welterweight matchup. Would love to see this fight. There's no chance it happens. I would love to see it happen in the future, but a lot of things are going to have to go right for that to happen. One of them is going to have to win a title. The other one's going to have to be able to move up and fight for that title or move down and fight for that title. So most likely we will never see Rakhmonov versus Chimaev, but that is a straight up banger. This may be the #1 fight I want to see in MMA right now. That's how good this matchup is. And that's just the featured fight on this fantasy UFC 300 card. Moving on to the co-main event, we have Alex Pereira defending his light heavyweight title against none other than Israel Adesanya. This fight is actually a little bit realistic. The UFC could throw this together for UFC 300. but I just feel like it doesn't make sense. Adesanya doesn't deserve a title shot up a weight class right now, coming off a loss against Sean Strickland. But man, would I love to see it at some point in time. And like, let's say the UFC's scrambling to put some fights together, and that's the best they can come up with. Sign me up. I mean, both of the fights that they've had so far in the UFC have been outright bangers. UFC 281 was incredible. It was super technical. You had Adesanya winning the fight and then gets starched in the 5th round. And then the most recent fight at UFC 287, Pereira gets over-aggressive and Adesanya just sleeps him with the right hand. Absolutely filthy finish. Then Pereira goes up a weight class, wins a very close fight against Jan Blachowicz, and then wins the title against Jiří Procházka. And now Adesanya loses his middleweight title in the meantime to Sean Strickland. And it would just be so interesting to see Adesanya go up and challenge Alex Pereira at 205. I think that's a totally different beast, but I would absolutely love to see these guys fight again. And it's going to be a bit of a travesty if we never get to see Pereira versus Adesanya 4 in the UFC. I just think it would be an incredible fight, or 3 in the UFC. Sorry, I'm mixing it up because there's been so many fights between the two and so many kickboxing matches, people always including. Would love this fight as a co-main event. And lastly, the main event for the UFC fantasy card. And I'm wondering if anybody would guess this fight that I'm putting as the main event. And that is Jon Jones versus Francis Ngannou. The one that got away, boys. This is truly the one that got away. This heavyweight title fight would be one of the biggest fights in UFC history, and I am so disgusted that we're not getting it. It sucks. It really sucks. I wish the UFC would have found a way to make it happen, but unfortunately, it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. They were negotiating with Jones. Jones finally comes back. They're negotiating with Francis. Francis inevitably leaves because the UFC isn't willing to offer him what he wants in terms of any type of, concessions to be able to go box, which could you imagine? Oh my, I'm so mad right now. I'm so mad. Imagine the hype of a Jon Jones, Francis Ngannou fight. Jon Jones coming off the Cyril Gane win in 1 round, and Francis Ngannou returning from arguably beating the best heavyweight boxer in Tyson Fury. That's the one that got away, guys. It's the one that got away. So that is my fantasy fight card. Again, Francis Ngannou, Jon Jones is the main event. Alex Pereira, Israel Adesanya, light heavyweight title co-main event. Featured fight, Shavkat Rakhmonov versus Khamzat Chimaev. 4th fight down the card, Charles Oliveira versus Benoit Saint-Denis. And the main card opener, Colby Covington versus Bilal Muhammad. Now let's get into the title fight card that I've made for UFC 300 that is realistic. Starting off with the fight that opens up the main card, and we have a familiar face from the fantasy card, and that is Colby Covington versus Ian Machado Gary. I want this fight so badly, and this is realistic. I know Gary is fighting at UFC 298 against Jeff Neal, but if he gets through Jeff Neal, you have Colby Covington, who is kind of in no man's land right now. He just lost to Leon Edwards. It was his third title fight. I don't think there's a bigger fight for Colby Covington right now than Ian Machado Gary, especially if Gary goes out there and beats Jeff Neal. And I think Gary, if he beats Jeff Neal, he needs at least one more win to be in true title contention. And who better to test his wrestling than Colby Covington, who's been talking crap about his wife and family. Would love to see this matchup. I think this is the fight to make, to be honest. I hope Jeff Neal falls out and then maybe they book Ian Machado Gary versus Colby Covington for UFC 300. I think this is a real missed opportunity. I think this would be a huge fight. I think it would be a massive fight for the fans. I think it would be an interesting test for Ian Machado Gary as well, to test his wrestling against a guy who has the wrestling credentials of Colby Covington, even though he seems a bit washed in the Leon Edwards fight. He was out for 2 years, claiming injury, all those excuses. But I would love to see this fight. The build-up would be amazing. And just a stylistic matchup, I would love to see how it went, because if Colby can't get a takedown, Ian Machado Gary is going to beat the brakes off of him, and I would absolutely love to see that opening up the main card of UFC 300. Moving on to the next fight on the title fight card for UFC 300, I have Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. This would be a banger, and this makes a lot of sense right now. I really think this is a fight the UFC should consider making. Charles Oliveira looked incredible in his last fight against Beneil Dariush, and Arman Tsarukyan looked incredible in his last fight against Beneil Dariush. Both finishing Beneil in the first round. I think Charles, I know he was booked to fight Islam Makhachev, but I would like to see him get a second win. And there's rumors of Islam Makhachev versus Justin Gaethje in Saudi Arabia. If that fight happens, Charles Oliveira is going to need a fight. Also, I don't think Charles Oliveira wants to go to Saudi Arabia, to be quite honest. So why not book Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan for the #1 contender spot in the lightweight division? And whoever wins that fight, let's say Charles Oliveira goes out there and starches Arman, that builds a massive lightweight title fight rematch against Islam Makhachev if he's able to get through Justin Gaethje in the meantime. And same thing for Arman Tsarukyan, a rematch years in the making. That would be a banger matchup in the lightweight division. I would love this fight. And Charles Oliveira is never in a boring fight. Arman Tsarukyan, very young prospect who came in on short notice and gave Islam Makhachev a very close fight. I think Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan is a fight that the UFC should make. And there's been rumors that this fight is getting made. Arman recently posted he has some fight news. Oliveira recently posted he has some fight news. So we could get this announcement soon. And if it is announced, I have a feeling it may very well be on UFC 300 because 298 and 299 are already kind of filled out unless they're adding more fights to Miami, which is UFC 299. I don't know where this fight's going to end up outside of UFC 300. So that makes Oliveira versus Tsarukyan a very realistic option. Moving up on the card to the featured fight on the main card, we have our first of 3 title fights. The first title fight is Alexandre Pantoja versus Manel Kape for the flyweight title. Now, Manel Kape does have a fight coming up against Matheus Nicolau. I suspect he will win that fight. And then he has like a roughly, 3-month turnaround, and he can fight Alexandre Pantoja for the title. Manel Kape is a guy who doesn't really seem to care. He'll turn around. He won't complain about any injuries, and he'll fight Pantoja. And this will be a rematch where Pantoja beat him a couple years ago. And this is a super compelling fight. Kape is a guy on a long win streak. If he goes out there, gets a win against Nicolau, I think that puts him in title contention. I know you got Albazi and Moreno waiting in the wings, but I would love to see Pantoja versus Kape. I think that'd be a straight up banger. Kape has power. He's been improving. I think he's much better since he originally fought Pantoja. And I think this would be a banger fight for the flyweight division. And I know a lot of casual fans aren't that excited about the flyweight division. Pantoja's highly underrated and Kape's highly underrated. Just because they're small fighters doesn't make it not a great fight. I think this is a banger matchup. And imagine if Kape goes out there and let's say he starches Nicolau. And let's say he takes no damage. It just makes perfect sense because you have Moreno versus Albazi in February, mid-February. They're not going to be able to turn around and fight on UFC 300. And if you want to stack UFC 300 with some title fights, it's not going to be, all the top weight classes. It's going to be some of the smaller weight classes. And that's why it makes perfect sense to have the featured fight on the card, Alexandre Pantoja versus Manel Kape. Would love to see this matchup. Would love to see this rematch on UFC 300. Moving on to the co-main event. And this fight might actually get a bit of hate from you guys in the comments. But that is Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 for the welterweight title. I know people are saying, oh, Bilal's boring and Leon's boring and neither one of them have personality and they're both cringy. I don't know how many times I have to say this, but this is an amazing matchup. This is an absolutely amazing matchup, and I don't know why these WWE fans that have infiltrated the UFC and want to turn the UFC into WWE don't appreciate the best versus the best. Belal Muhammad is on a 10-fight unbeaten streak. Leon Edwards is on a crazy win streak. He's the undisputed welterweight champion. They fought a while ago. They fought back in 2021, but that was years ago when Belal Muhammad stepped in on short notice. We didn't get to see the fight play out. He got poked in the eye, and people were acting like, oh, well, we've already seen it. Belal stepped in on short notice for Khamzat Chimaev, keep in mind, and it was the first round Leon Edwards clearly won, but it wasn't like a complete blowout. I actually recently rewatched it. Leon Edwards landed a really good head kick and a really good punch. I don't remember if it was a left or right. And outside of that, the first round was uneventful. And then the beginning of the second round, Belal got eye poked. Belal has got substantially better since that point in time. Leon Edwards has gotten substantially better since that point of time. And honestly, this is a hot take that I was talking about on my live stream earlier. I think Leon Edwards versus Belal Muhammad 2 could headline a pay-per-view in terms of my interest in that fight. Not UFC 300, of course, but in terms of a headliner for a UFC pay-per-view, I much prefer that over some of these undeserved title fights that the UFC is just dishing out. I think this is a much better fight than Leon Edwards versus Colby Covington, in my opinion, and I would love to have this welterweight title fight as the co-main event to UFC 300, and I would love to see Belal Muhammad finally get his welterweight title shot. Moving on to the main event of UFC 300. And this one, it's kind of iffy because it relies on another fight outcome. But the main event of the title fight card for UFC 300 is Dricus du Plessis versus Israel Adesanya. This is the fight to make. This is the fight. This is the one that got away last year because the UFC was so adamant on making du Plessis turn around quickly. He couldn't because of his foot or his ankle. And then you have Adesanya go against Strickland, and Strickland beats him. And, regardless of the reasons that you think Strickland may or may not have beat Adesanya, we all still want to see Du Plessis versus Adesanya. And I know we have to see what happens at UFC 297. We have Sean Strickland versus Dricus Du Plessis. Maybe Sean Strickland wins. In that case, make the main event Strickland versus Adesanya too. And I know that sounds crazy. That would be a massive fight, because if Adesanya loses that, for all you guys who hate Adesanya, if he loses that fight, his middleweight title contention is done until Strickland loses that belt. And Adesanya's hinting at coming back soon. I think the Dricus Du Plessis versus Adesanya fight's much better, and that's why that's my headliner. If it was Strickland, maybe we talk about another headliner. I don't know what it would be. But for me, I think it should be Du Plessis, if he wins at 297, versus Adesanya. We can argue about who's more African, and we can talk about nationality and ethnicity and all these different things. And, it'll be so great. I'm kidding. The build-up would be interesting, to say the least. But also the stylistic clash, especially now that Du Plessis starts Robert Whittaker. Then if he goes out there and beats up Sean Strickland to win the title, where Strickland's just coming off a win against Adesanya, it would be so interesting to see Du Plessis. Imagine that dynamic. I never even considered that. Imagine that dynamic of Du Plessis defending his middleweight title against Israel Adesanya at UFC 300. That would be a straight up banger card for UFC 300 and an amazing main event. So just to recap that fight card before we get to my non-title fight card: Dricus versus Adesanya. Then we have Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad 2. Then we have Alexandre Pantoja versus Manel Kape 2. Then we have Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. And lastly, we have Colby Covington versus Ian Machado Gary. And also, if Gary isn't able to go, throw Shavkat in there. Shavkat should be ready by UFC 300. Okay, moving on to my non-title fight card for UFC 300. And let me know what you guys think of all these cards, and let me know what you would build UFC 300 at as well. What fights would you put on UFC 300? I'm genuinely curious down in the comments. But starting off with a fight that opens up the non-title UFC 300 main card, and this is a fight that I've already talked about. That is Colby Covington versus Ian Machado Gary. I'm keeping that opener from the title fight card. I think that's a banger fight. I'm just going to leave it as is. I'm not going to talk about it anymore because I've already discussed it. Next up, we're going to have another repetitive fight from the non-title fight card, and we are going to have Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan. Again, I've already discussed that in the title fight card, so I'm not going to rehash it now. Banger fight. So right now, we have the first two fights matched between the non-title fight card and the title fight card. But moving on to the first different fight, the featured fight on the main card is Justin Gaethje versus Benoit Saint-Denis. Benoit Saint-Denis is an outright savage. He's on the rise in the lightweight division. He's calling out Justin Gaethje. I know Justin Gaethje may end up fighting Islam Makhachev, but if he doesn't, and let's say they book Islam versus Oliveira too, that is the fight to make. I desperately want Justin Gaethje versus Benoit Saint-Denis. That is a straight up savage fight. I know technically it would probably be for the BMF title. I don't care about the BMF title. So this is still a non-title fight card because that's a fake WWE title the UFC uses as a promotional tool. Justin Gaethje versus Benoit Saint-Denis. It has me salivating right now. I mean, I want that fight badly. I want that fight so badly. That would be craziness. Imagine how wild and crazy that fight would be while it lasts. And I know people are like, oh, Justin Gaethje, he's so good, he would starch Benoit Saint-Denis. Don't be so sure, because Benoit Saint-Denis is so well-rounded. He's powerful. He has good striking. He has amazing kicks, but he also has good grappling and takedowns as well. And he's so durable and has so much heart and has unbelievable stamina. I think I could even pick Benoit Saint-Denis over Justin Gaethje. If there's ever been a fight for a true BMF title, even though I don't want to talk about it too much because, again, it's a fake belt, that is the fight to make. I think that would be an amazing featured fight on the main card of UFC 300. And honestly, that could be a headliner of like a regular pay-per-view card. That's how good that fight is. I can't even imagine a world, the excitement level and the way I would feel as Benoit Saint-Denis and Justin Gaethje are staring each other down across the cage while Bruce Buffer is announcing each of their names. Sign me up for that fight immediately. Moving on to the co-main event, we have Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev in the middleweight division. This would be a straight up banger. This is an amazing matchup. Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev is kind of a fantasy matchup a lot of people have had since Khamzat decided to move up. A lot of people thought, oh, Khamzat Chimaev is the middleweight contender that could take the belt away from Israel Adesanya. And while I never necessarily agreed with that, Khamzat Chimaev just got a win against Kamaru Usman on short notice. Usman stepped in on short notice. It wasn't all that impressive. I thought it was impressive, but people are kind of downplaying a bit because he beat up a welterweight on short notice, and that's why I hate short notice fights. Who better to beat to become the #1 contender than the former champion Israel Adesanya? And what a stylistic clash that would be. And Khamzat's been calling out Israel Adesanya. Adesanya recently made remarks that he'll be returning sooner rather than later. And I would love to see how that fight played out because Khamzat no doubt would try to go out and maul him in the first round. I don't know if he's going to have success. Adesanya has great footwork, great takedown defense. But let's say Khamzat does maul him in the first round. If he's not able to find a finish, what does that second, third, fourth, and fifth round look like? Because let me be very clear. This needs to be a five-round non-title co-main event. There's no way this is a 3-round fight. Adesanya versus Chimaev needs to be a 5-round fight. #1 contender fight for the middleweight division. And honestly, this could be the main event. This would be a massive fight. Adesanya, we already know that he's a draw. He's a star in the UFC. Khamzat Chimaev is, I would consider him a draw and a star in the UFC or on the verge of that. And that would be a huge fight for UFC 300. If we're not going to have any title fights on UFC 300, we need to think outside the box. We need to have these massive fights that are important to the division, but also have name value. And that's exactly what Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev is. And that's why it should be the co-main event. Winner fights the winner of Du Plessis versus Strickland at UFC 297. So essentially, summer, fall of 2024, we're looking at the winner of Strickland versus Du Plessis versus the winner of Adesanya versus Chimaev. And that way, Chimaev gets another win before he gets a title fight, doesn't get a title fight after a win over a short notice Kamaru Usman. And Adesanya doesn't kind of get an undeserved title shot coming off a loss against Sean Strickland and jumping right back into the title picture, even though I do kind of understand that, considering he was a long-reigning champion, even though he did lose to Pereira. I know technically that's not true, but you get my point. It would just cure up a lot of issues with the middleweight division, and I would love to see that fight stylistically. I don't care if it's for a title or not. It must be 5 rounds, though. Would absolutely love to see Israel Adesanya versus Khamzat Chimaev. Moving on to the main event of the non-title fight card. And these fight cards, the title fight card and the non-title fight card, I've built somewhat realistically. And that's why the main event of the non-title fight card is the fight that I believe will end up being the main event of UFC 300. And that is Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 3. Now, I know this isn't the massive fight that a lot of people want to see, but it is a big fight. It is the trilogy fight that people have wanted to see since 2016. And I understand that Conor McGregor's been out for a while, coming back from a catastrophic injury. They teased the Chandler fight. I don't think Chandler's ever getting that matchup. And if you like Conor McGregor or you hate Conor McGregor, you know, him coming back from a catastrophic injury and going against Michael Chandler is just not, you know, it's not conducive for success at all. And not that I'm saying that Conor McGregor should be babied, but if they can make a fight that a lot of fans want to see, and it's a fight that Conor McGregor can at least try to win, and I know he could win against Michael Chandler as well, but Conor's been hinting at a tune-up fight. I think that's the fight to make. And the reason this is my main event, obviously there's other fights that I would much prefer. I don't even love McGregor versus Diaz, but I think this is the most realistic option. So that's why I put it as the main event. And I wouldn't hate it. I mean, I wouldn't mind seeing McGregor Diaz kind of close that chapter, but this is a trilogy that should have happened a long time ago. So if they're going to make that the main event, it better be stacked underneath of it like I just already, you know, the fights I already gave you. I wouldn't complain about the main event if we get Adesanya versus Chimaev as co-main. That's why I built this card so stacked, because the main event, while it is great, it would have been much better back in 2017, you know, because both guys are kind of towards the end of their careers. You know, Nate Diaz is getting beat up by YouTubers in the boxing ring. But I do believe that fight will happen. And I do believe it will most likely main event UFC 300. And I think it's a fight that will be competitive. I think it will be exciting. And I think the story and the buildup of that fight would have the magnitude and the spectacle that we need for UFC 300. And that's why that is my main event. Again, I'm not super pumped for that fight. But at the end of the day, I'm looking at Conor McGregor now, and I'm like, I don't even want to see him fight Chandler. What's the point of seeing a fight where you already know the outcome? It's like a Kevin Holland short notice fight. We already know he's going to lose. So why don't we at least book a fight where maybe he can win? And imagine Nate Diaz goes out there and gets a win. It'd be very interesting. You could see the quadrilogy. You could see a fourth fight between them for all we know. So I think that would be a really solid main event to cap off a super stacked non-title fight card with Khamzat Chimaev versus Israel Adesanya as the co-main event. Justin Gaethje versus Benoit Saint-Denis, featured fight on the card. Charles Oliveira versus Arman Tsarukyan, fourth fight down, and card opener, Colby Covington versus Ian Machado Gary. Let me know what you guys think of these three cards. Is there any fights I missed? Am I crazy for putting these fights on a card? What fight card do you think will actually happen at UFC 300? Just let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to like the video, and thank you so much for watching.